Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. And good afternoon or good evening to our participants online. I'm Sam Ki Chen. I'm the coordinator of the China Working Group. I'm very honored today to welcome you and our speakers to our full-day workshop on the political economy of China's development in the 21st century. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to thank the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos for providing the venue today, and especially to Aurania, you just met, for her help in organizing the event. As this is a full-day workshop, please feel free to take breaks when you need it. The bathrooms are just outside at the corner, and the cafe is further down along the corridor. So you may have met it when you came from the entrance. Feel free to get yourself coffee or tea at any time. We have lunch break at 12:15. And you can proceed to the cafeteria, which is there, but that's only served sandwiches and cafe and coffee and stuff. If you want hot meal, then it is further down when you enter for the registration desk outside up the stairs on the left-hand side. There is a cafeteria for hot meal if you fancy. So after the lunch break, then we come back to here at 1:30 to start our afternoon session. Yes, because the conference hasn't really started today and the budget is very limited. So the organizer apologizes that they couldn't serve us refreshments today. So participants will have to buy the lunch and coffee or tea, but it's a very reasonable price. Okay, so there will be Q&A after all the speakers in each session, and the audience both in here and also online can raise your questions or give your comments, but please remember, keep them brief and concise, and give your name and affiliations before you start. And the first speaker will speak for about 30 minutes, and the discussant, each of them have about 10 minutes to give feedback. And then we proceed to the Q&A. Okay. The first session today is China and the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Professor Dick Low will give a presentation. Professor Radhika Desai and Professor Jie will give their feedback following Dick's presentation. Dick Low is reader in economics at SOAS, University of London. His research focuses on China and world development, neoliberal globalization, and the political economy of historical capitalism and historical socialism. He has publications by academic publishers and in scholarly journals, including Cambridge Journal of Economics, China Quarterly, Journal of Economic Issues, Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, Review of Radical Political Economics, and Third World Quarterly. He is also a columnist, and I'm a follower. His commentaries on contemporary political economic issues and his contributions to the relevant scholarly and political debate have been circulated widely in China and overseas Chinese communities. Radhika Desai is professor in the Department of Political Studies and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, Canada. And she's also convener of the International Manifesto Group. Her new book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, investigates the decay of neoliberal financialized capitalism as revealed in the crisis the novel coronavirus triggered, but did not cause a crisis that has been deepened by the conflict over Ukraine and its repercussions across the globe. We are actually having her book launch in the conference tomorrow afternoon. It is very relevant to our topic today, which Dick is going to present. I recommend you to read Radhika's book, especially chapter 5, The Unexpected Reckoning, which is very relevant to our talk today. Professor Jie is professor in economics in Fudan University in Shanghai. He is the chief editor of the Chinese Journal of Political Economy. He specializes in Marxist economics and Chinese market socialism. He also has been living in China throughout the whole period of the pandemic. So he has firsthand information if you want to ask him what it was like in China at the time. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Dick Low. think here I will just. Yeah. And I will have to make it.
Full screen. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here in the room and online. And it's also a great opportunity for us to have exchange, sharing our views on the pandemic crisis and deepen political economy of the crisis. We all have personal experiences during the crisis. And although the crisis of the pandemic seems over, at least in terms of the systematic efforts to try to fight the pandemic by national governments, it seems to have already come to an end. Nevertheless, we cannot let pass the experience, the crisis, without deepening our understanding of the functioning and the nature of national governments and the existing world political economic order. So what I would like to do today is to try to approach the topics from in a sense, the political economy perspective. Because of the limit of time, so I'll try to first give a quick summary of the overall theme of the presentation and then go into the details. That is easy to understand that the pandemic crisis has offered fundamentally important political lessons and food for thought for political activist forces across the world. Now, and China has a particularly important position in the crisis, that it is the first country in the world to have discovered and openly reported the outbreak of COVID in the early time of January 2020. And it's also probably the last country to terminate systematic efforts to cope with COVID towards the end of 2022. And during this 3 years period, China adopted an anti-pandemic strategy that stands in contrast to most neoliberal capitalist countries. The strategy known as dynamic zero is diametrically opposed to that of living with the virus, the latter being characteristic of the political economic regimes that prioritize profits over public health. Now, of course, China ended or abandoned the dynamic zeros towards the end of 2022, but that does not imply that China, after all, is no less neoliberal compared with most advanced capitalist countries and also most developing countries. Note that China made this dramatic turn only at the time of Omicron, and with almost complete vaccination of the population. So that's completely different from most other countries. Now I noticed quite many left-wing commentators, both in the West and inside China, they try to put China on the same at the same position as the advanced capitalist countries, arguing that in the end they have done the same thing. But that is not convincing, because of the fundamental differences which I've just mentioned. But still, the somewhat abrupt and chaotic termination of the pandemic and anti-pandemic endeavors thus reveal the limits of China's deviation from neoliberalism. And as I'll try to argue, in fact, it indicates the uneasy position of China in the neoliberal capitalist world, given the fact that the Chinese economy and political economy in general has been deeply integrated into the world capitalist economy. Now, I won't be able to go into the details of the actual performance of the China in comparison, in international comparison, in terms of the actual the scale of the infections, death, etc. Right? But because of time limitation, right? But it is quite easy to say that in the first 2 years, that is before the Omicron, right? That the Chinese performance in terms of controlling the pandemics, the infection rates, death rates, vastly outperformed the world average, and in particular, the United States. And so we need not go into details of these numbers, which you can easily get from the public sources. But what is important is that the differences in performance in terms of fighting the pandemics reveals the functioning, the capability, and the orientations of the political economic systems of China versus other countries, in particular the United States. After all, China vastly outperformed the US in terms of controlling the pandemics. In the meantime, the material conditions available for China was much less developed. According to the Global Health Security Index, the US was put at the top of among all the countries in the world, in terms of the facilities available, the incomes available, in a nutshell, the material conditions available. But nevertheless, and also, of course, the Chinese population was much bigger than the US. But nevertheless, we have the opposite comparison in terms of actual performance. And therefore, it is possible to infer from this comparison that the contrast is likely due to political, economic, and institutional reasons. And of course, it's not just in terms of the performance of controlling the pandemics, but also in terms of the cost. Right? First, in terms of economic cost, of course, China, just in terms of economic growth, right, on average for the 3 years, 4.5%, right, as opposed to 1.7% of the US. And of course, if we assume that the preceding 3 years, 2017 to 19, assuming that they were, so to speak, normal, then you can see that the 4.5 was about 69% of the average of the preceding 3 years of 6.5%. So about 30% of the growth being lost. And incidentally, it's very similar that the US 1.7% was about 68% of the 2.5% of the preceding 3 years. Right. So China and the US seems to be performing equal in terms of economic cost. But of course, we know that things are more complex, right? That the US adopted very aggressive monetary policies over this period. And the US also took advantage of the outbreak of the conflicts in Ukraine, right, and therefore seizing upon the benefits, right, the flows of capital from the Europe and industry from Europe to the US. Right? So the US, in a nutshell, managed to maintain this growth performance on the basis of, in a sense, exploiting the rest of the world. That's not the case for China, right? So the comparisons, the economic comparisons, we need to take into the consideration of these further complexities. Now, in terms of the social cost, that's difficult to measure, right? But nevertheless, in the end, all kinds of political, economic, social, cultural, ideological, whatsoever causes should show up in the performance of life expectancy at birth. Right? Now, we do have data of the first 2 years, right, from the World Bank reported by the governments, but we don't have the latest data of 2022 that are mostly from estimates by scholars. Nevertheless, the generous estimate for the US is the reduction of the life expectancy by 1.39 years, whereas in the case of China, it's 0.04 year. So that might be the indication of an overall indicator of the social cost. Now, let's move on to the actual measures being taken or the strategies being adopted by the governments. China represents at the one extreme of what I call the tough model, right? Social distancing, tracing, medication, right? and lockdowns, and so on. The US, despite all the initial efforts, right, to cope with the outbreak of the crisis, very quickly turned to what I call the lax models, right, that virtually doing nothing, right, in terms of trying to cope with the crisis, right, or put another way, right, prioritizing the profits or the reproduction of the existing capitalist activities over the consideration for public life. So that's in short, the two countries represents the two extremes of the spectrum of measures or strategies to cope with the crisis. Of course, there were countries that were even more extreme compared to the US, like say some East European countries or North Europe, the Nordic countries like Sweden, or the Czech Republic or the Baltic countries. They announced that they would not do anything from the very beginnings. Practicing what initially the Boris Johnson wanted, right, in the UK, to the herd immunity. But nevertheless, despite all the twists and turns in the US, still it's fair to say that it basically followed a lax strategy over the 3 years. Now, how to assess these two strategies and all the different strategies in between? We can, at one level, we can employ the theory provided by the economist Amartya Sen, who argues that information transparency is the most important in coping with natural disasters of different kinds, including pandemics of this kind. Right? That if you have information transparency, and additionally, you have liberal democracy, that is competitive politics, then you will have the sufficient incentive and information to cope with natural disasters, or at least you would comparatively do the best. Right? That presupposes the existence of information in the first place. Information is objectively existing, so what you need is transparency, and then you can get the work done. Now, the difficulty is that information did not exist in the time of the outbreak of the pandemic. You need acquisition through the process of learning by doing, to get the necessary information. That is to say that it is knowledge rather than information concerning the nature of the virus, in terms of the rates of transmission, in terms of the rates of the death rate, and the impact on different groupings of people in the societies. Now, then we know that China was the first one to in this case, in this circumstance, we need an alternative theoretical frameworks. The frameworks by the theory of Albert Hirschman's, that whereby knowledge is at the center of the product being traded. The product here, we are talking about the state or collective-led endeavors to cope with the pandemics. Now, this is not just a matter of the individual rational choices, free to choose, because the freedom of individuals inevitably will have the impact on the well-being of the other people and for the society as a whole. It's a kind of compulsory that it's not that as an individual you like or don't like to cope with the pandemics, because your action will affect the rest of the society. And therefore, collective endeavors would definitely be needed, if the society does want to cope with, to keep the pandemic under control. Of course, if the consensus is to do nothing, is to go for herd immunity, then that is another matter. It is the extreme form of the so-called free to choose. Otherwise, it's free to lose rather than free to choose. And this, so once it is accepted that we do need this product, that is the collective endeavor to cope with the virus, then there are the two possible options, voice or loyalty. Voice option is that people agree to tolerate the collectively led efforts, although they are unwillingly to accept it, but they know that the otherwise the cost for themselves individually would be greater. Now, and then we have the loyalty option, which tells us that cooperation rather than competition is necessary for coping with the crisis. So this is the framework of the Hirschman, and the most important thing is the distinction between information and knowledge. Knowledge is the outcome of learning and acquisition, and in this case, it's an outcome of collective information, so collective learning. And of course, in the beginning, China had to confront the outbreak of the virus as an unexpected unknown, and therefore mistakes were made, and mistakes were made initially, which have been remains a matter of the debates still nowadays that it's defensible to say that indeed the Chinese system, both the local bureaucrats as well as the public health system, did make the mistake of had some degree of malfeasance in the early weeks of the outbreaks, roughly from the late December 2019 up for 3 weeks or so, up until the confirmation and announcement of the outbreaks. The mistake was the first, the local government sends the samples for testing to unqualified laboratories. And second, the public health system set up the criteria for the confirmation, and one criterion was that the people need to have the experience of visiting that seafood market, right? That assumes that the virus had not spread to other places outside the seafood markets. Right? So this was the mistake made. But nevertheless, it is also fair to say that the public health system did the job of testing and therefore confirming large-scale testing, and of course developing the testing kits and then testing and confirming the outbreak in 3 weeks' time. That was much faster than other the similar outbreaks of the epidemics in other parts of the world. I mean, compared with all the presidents. Right? So it's fair to say that the system did work to fulfill its duty. The problem, however, is that this time around, the COVID pandemic was much more serious compared to the capacity of the public health system. China established this new public health system in the early years of this century, after the outbreak of the SARS disease in 2003. Right? So the new system, very much a copy of the US CDC system, right? Relying on professionals to cope with the natural disasters, public health disasters of this kind. That's a departure from China's own tradition of what's known as the People's War, right? That the mass mobilization, the general public participating in the control and prevention of natural disasters. That was the system that existed in China pre-reform and continued up until the 1990s. But it became increasingly weakened because of the collapse of the collective system, in particular in the countryside. The people's commune system dismantled. Therefore, in the early years of the century, with the outbreak of the SARS disease, China had to re-establish a public health system, and it copied the US system of relying on the professionals, public health professionals alone. And that is why this time around, the system turned out to be insufficient, and therefore the outbreak of the spread of the crisis. And in a sense, the China's tough model adopted the dynamic zero strategy over these 3 years was the resumption of the tradition in combination with the professionals, so that the collective endeavors, cooperation, and the society in support of state-led strategy of the tough measures, the mobilization of resources, the lockdowns, testing, medications, tracing, and so on, all this being maintained. Now, this turned out to be very effective in the first 2 years. At the time, with the virus from Alpha to Delta being with very limited transmission rates and very high death rates, so easier to detect. But then, as we see, when it comes to the Omicron, that it becomes increasingly deficient. Now, the opposite might seem to be the case that in the US system, that it, with the lax system, the lax approach or model, quite relaxing, therefore, abandoning all the tough, tracing, the distancing, and so on. It was very ineffective and inefficient for coping with the crisis from the Alpha to Delta, and therefore the high death rates. Now, therefore, moving to the time of the Omicrons, with the high transmission rates and low mortality rates, the tough model being fundamentally undermined, or to put another way, the cost for maintaining the dynamic zero strategy becoming increasing and becoming exceedingly high. And one simple indicator is that the Chinese government set the target of economic growth 5.5% in the year 2022. That was based on its judgment of not just about the economy, but more importantly, about the evolution of the virus that is continued to be similar to Delta, high mortality rates and limited transmission rates. But in the events, the economic growth rate was only 3%, almost a half of the targets, and because of the changing nature of the virus. And that therefore largely underestimates the degree of social fatigue, or the people, not just in terms of the psychological, but also the material conditions, the massive increase in the bankruptcy of business, like in particular small-scale services business, and of course the massive increase in the unemployment rates. So all kinds of social costs massively increased because of the changing nature of the virus, and in conjunction with the increasing ineffectiveness of the dynamic zero, the strategy. But nevertheless, it is still fair to say that despite this fundamental change, as I mentioned, that the China in the end abandons the dynamic zeros on the basis of two important considerations. One consideration, of course, is the nature of Omicron being very different from the Alpha to Delta. And secondly, vaccination, that's in the run-up to the outbreak of Omicron, Omicron came out in November 2022. China had already had the vaccination, the dose administered as a ratio to the population. On average, each person got 3 jabs of the the vaccination. And of course, there is the sufficient evidence to suggest that a person with the 3 doses of vaccination of the Chinese vaccine were as effective as the Pfizer vaccines. So that is very much confirmed by the evidence in the different countries that had both types of vaccinations or vaccines. So it's to sum up, we can say that the comparative performance of China versus the US, and in comparison with most other countries in between of these 2 models of fighting the pandemics, it requires explanations. And one line of investigation is to focus on comparative political economy, that is the nature and the functioning of the respective governance structures, and therefore the basic political economic systems. And as mentioned, according to the theory of Amartya Sen, which seems to have been adopted by most Western, the establishment of the commentators, scholarly and journalistic, as well as the political establishment, they tend to argue that the liberal democracy with transparency of information and competitive politics should be the best for coping with natural disasters, including this time around the pandemics, COVID. And unfortunately, this has also been the view of many of the Western left-wing political forces in their critiques of not just the Western advanced capitalist countries, but also of every countries, including China. But of course, they always have the claim, unproven claim that you have only 2 alternatives. One is the actual history. The alternative is that we have world revolution tomorrow, establishing world socialism, and that solved all the problem. And any deviation from that is condemned. That, of course, is not simply miss out the complexities of the world. Now we need to be taking into consideration of the complexities. We need to put at the level of governance, put the comparison between the theory of theoretical framework of Sen and of Hirschman's, and at the level of the political economic systems that the liberal democracy, as opposed to the Leninist theory of the people's democracy, whereby cooperative politics and the cooperative politics involving the society as a whole. I'm not saying that this tool represents China versus the US, but rather that we can learn important lessons from this, in the actual history, in the actual experiences, China versus the US, and therefore theoretically the theory of the Sen versus Hirschman, and ultimately liberal democracy versus people's democracy, rather than the almost consensus of democracy versus authoritarianism, which, as I mentioned, is almost the consensus in the West, not just of the political establishments, but unfortunately, most of the left-wing groupings in the West. Okay, I think I will stop at this point and hope to receive your comments and criticism. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And Radhika, you can stay here.
Yeah, where can they see me? There, I think I can see. Very good. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you to Sam Ki-chung for organizing this, to Professor Dick Low for presenting a really fascinating paper. It's a subject, as Sam Ki has already said, on which I've written something. So I guess what I'm going to try and do today is try and first of all say something about what I've done, but also always in conversation with what Professor Low has said in a paper which I thought was really great, in which I learned a lot. So I will sort of start with my own writing on it, but then I will raise a number of specific questions that arise in my mind as I listened to and read Professor Low's presentation. So first of all, I completely agree with Professor Low that the overall question that we face when regarding the differences in the pandemic performance of China versus the US is a question of the overall social organization. You can call it economic model or what have you. Professor Low posed it in terms of, whether you can talk about democracy versus authoritarianism and so on. The way I looked at it, it was a contrast between, on the one hand, what I call neoliberal financialized capitalism, which has reached its most advanced form in two countries in particular, the US and the UK. So I compared the performance in these countries. And on the other hand, socialism, actually existing socialism, etc. So I think these are two very contrasting economic models. By focusing on neoliberal financialized capitalism, I'm also contrasting the economic model that you have today in the United States and in the UK from the post-war model of Keynesian welfare states, etc., which had a very different organization. So we are contrasting in two different ways: the past of these societies and then with China. So that is the overall thing. The reason I wrote Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, which by the way began as a book on just capitalism and coronavirus, but then I was late in submitting the manuscript, the Russian special military operation started, and I realized that what I was criticizing about Western neoliberal financialized capitalism vis-a-vis coronavirus were also the same, or more or less the same issues that I wanted to pick up in terms of analyzing the war. So I folded the war into it, and that's what the book became. My reason for writing this book, originally as Capitalism and Coronavirus, was actually to point out that we are looking at the pandemic is going to constitute a knockdown crisis of neoliberal financialized capitalism, because this pandemic is hitting a society whose economic model has already become weakened, and the pandemic is going to deal a blow to it, and it's going to, as I said, accelerate the decline of Western capitalism, Western neoliberal financialized capitalism, and accelerate the divergence between it and China in particular, and to a lesser extent the other societies. So it is both a crisis domestically of the capitalist system, and in terms of what I call the geopolitical economy of the world order. So in both senses, it is a crisis. And then very quickly, I mean, I pointed to a number of different things. Even before this public health crisis occurred, a number of prominent critical economists were already expecting a major knockdown crisis of financialization, another financial crisis, and so on. In this context, the capitalist authorities actually took, as Professor Low already said very briefly, they already considered the possibility, their capacity to respond to the crisis in any sort of robust fashion was already so bad that they actually considered allowing what's called herd. They misuse the word herd immunity. They considered herd immunity. What is meant by this? Herd immunity is an expression used by people who understand, who deal in vaccines, epidemiologists, to talk about a level of immunity that is reached with a certain level of vaccination. The way in which leaders like Johnson and Trump used it is to say, we are going to allow the pandemic to rip through the population, let them take who they will. That was the idea. They were only stopped from considering this because people pointed out that if they do this, the level of economic disruption will be even greater because people will stay at home naturally. If the government is not doing anything, you will take it upon yourself to do what you can. You will stay away from work. You will protect your, etc. You will not send kids to school, etc., etc. All of these things will happen. So then they said, okay, we're going to have to do something. Then what did they do? And Professor Lowe, you used the term living with the virus, but there was another very revealing term that was used, and that was well, two others. One is flattening the curve. We want to flatten the curve so that our health system is not overwhelmed. Now, it seems like a very simple objective statement, but what it does not say is that they are talking about a health system that has already been weakened by decades of neoliberalism. So the wealth system has actually been actively weakened by this type of capitalism. And that is the one, and you are not talking about augmenting it. You're not talking about giving it the resources, as Professor Lowe said, and this is something I learned in his paper. In China, also a certain amount of deterioration had taken place, but the government's response to the crisis was to say, okay, we're going to beef up the capacity of this system to work on the ground. And that's what they did. In these neoliberal financialized countries, you did not get that. The health system was going to be what it was, and the government was going to regulate the level of restrictions such that the health system would not be overwhelmed. That was the only aim. And so Boris Johnson stands in front of the podium and says, save the NHS, comply with the regulations and restrictions. And I remember public health experts of roughly my age saying, when I was growing up, I was told that the NHS, the National Health Service, exists to save us. Now we are being asked to save the NHS. At the moment of peril, when the NHS should be vastly expanded so that it can save us, we are being asked to save the NHS. What kind of a ridiculous situation is that? Okay, so this is the level of, furthermore, science itself. So also we should know that the preparation for the pandemic, zoonotic viruses, and the frequency with which they are jumping onto the human population has been increasing in the era of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism has been associated with a rampant expansion of the contact between human society and human activities and wild animals. It's not just the food market, the wet market in Wuhan or anything like that. We have factory farms all over the place, and the levels of, right now, just last summer, we had killed, or was it this summer, we killed a lot of birds because, and birds are dying because avian flu is spreading, because wild birds are interacting with factory farmed birds. Anyway, so this has already been increasing. In response to this, instead of having effective methods to track where this might happen, where zoonotic viruses may jump to human beings, which can be, defined, where there are factory farms, where other types of activities are bringing human beings and wild animals, or humanly farmed animals and wild animals into contact. Instead of monitoring those areas, what we do is we fund a science that is hungry for profit by having projects like the Global Virome Project. There is no need to map all the viruses in the world. What we need to do, first and foremost, is to monitor these fault lines along which zoonotic jumping will take place. We're not doing that. Why? Because that does not profit the big corporations. What profits the big corporations is these big billion-dollar projects called Global Virome Projects. So science had also gone off the rails. So Gosh, I'm going on too much and I'm going to exceed my 10 minutes. So I'm just very quickly going to jump to some questions for Professor Lowe. But basically my overall point is that neoliberal financialized capitalism has failed. And by the way, the crisis is not over. The public health crisis may come back. The economic crisis is still with us. And interestingly, the big factor in the economic crisis is labor. Labor has been most affected because ultimately when you fail on public health terms, you have failed your people. And that's why the labor is going to be a major source of crisis. But so very quickly, questions for Professor Lowe. Number one, I would like to know exactly why, and because I think you know more about this than China, exactly why you think the authorities decided to retract from the tough model, and also what are the limits of China's model that were revealed by this, because it's I guess I'd like you to expand on that a little bit. You are absolutely right. Yeah, so that's the first question. The second question that I have is, I'm told, when I was researching this, that China counts COVID deaths differently from the West. So how much do you think that affects the counts that we are looking at? Because I used in my book the same sources as you did, Our World in Data and so on. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that. And then finally, what do you think are the economic changes prompted by the pandemic, both in China and in the US, that you think are of long-term consequence? So in order to remain within my 10 minutes, I will end here, but I have so much more to say. Perhaps we can discuss later.
Thank you very much, Radhika. Professor Manzi. Okay. So actually, Manji is not going to do the 10 minutes. So Radhika, if you want to extend your 10 minutes, actually, you have the time to do it if you want.
Sure. So why is are you not going to speak? Sorry?
He said, yes, he will give his time to you.
Oh, all right. Well, how much time do I have then?
Maybe another 10.
Okay, very quickly. Then I'll just keep my stopwatch on and stop and start again. Oops. Okay. All right. Well, so then I would like to say a couple of more things. So, one of the other things that happened during the pandemic in the Western countries, and interestingly, my focus is actually on what went wrong in the neoliberal financialized economies, and Professor Lowe's focus has been on what went right in China. So it's a very interesting set of contrasts. So the first thing is that you see, in the context of, in the Western world, the expectations of what the government ought to do in order to address the pandemic were formed by the by the golden age Keynesian welfare state type society, where people expected that the government would take care of them, because that was the era in which, thanks to a vast popular mobilization, union strength of left parties, etc., you got a very different type of society. So the expectations from the past still lingered, but the reality was very different. And here I would say that, it is interesting to compare what happened even in first world countries during the Spanish flu and now. So during the Spanish flu, all the governments did was, first of all, there was also a lot of denial. The reason why we call what happened in 1918 and 19 and so on the Spanish flu is because actually the pandemic began in Europe, but none of the belligerent parties were willing to admit that there was a pandemic, and only neutral Spain was openly admitting that there was a pandemic. So it was called the Spanish flu. Actually, apparently it was an American flu because the American troops coming to Europe brought it with them, but that's another point. So in the Spanish flu, the governments only warned of the crisis. And I would say that neoliberal financialized governments, had it not been for this lingering expectation, and of course the fear of the level of economic disruption that would occur, they would have gone for a similar strategy, doing not very much at all. Yeah. So now also I just want to say that, one of the way in which I like everybody else, we all became armchair epidemiologists during the pandemic. But I tended to follow the expertise of a very interesting group of UK doctors called Independent Sage. So, they have this in the UK, they have the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, a SAGE for short. And SAGE was advising the government. And then this independent group or independent SAGE formed itself in order both to criticize some of SAGE's advice, the official SAGE's advice, but also sometimes what the government did regardless of SAGE's advice. And they were very interesting. They pointed out that the strategy that everyone has to adopt, the best public health strategy is find, test, trace, isolate, and support. This was the short form. So this requires not the kind of very corporate model of healthcare that we have with big hospitals and so on. It requires you to have community-based health workers who have the trust of the local population, and there they will provide the information. Yes, XYZ has been infected. This is fine. These people are, why should we have vaccinations? This kind of trust-based strategy is what this would mean. And this was exactly what was lacking in the UK. For example, they did have some sort of excuse for testing and tracing. They gave this a new organization, which was a new company that was formed by a friend of Boris Johnson's. I forget her name, Baroness somebody or other. And she essentially hired a bunch of people off the streets who were not properly trained to do test and trace. Okay, to do tracing. Tracing, these people, they very often did not, they was just basically calling people. It was a call center. So this did not give more information. So the other aspect of the strategy here that was adopted, rather than this sort of community-based strategy, which requires you to hire lots and lots of community workers, you got a neoliberal corporate strategy in which lots of corporations got rich at the expense of, like in the pandemic. The pandemic became an opportunity to get rich for a lot of corporations. So this response is again a complete contrast to what happened in China, where the government rolled up its sleeves and said, we are going to protect lives. And that reminds me of the other way in which, there is living with the virus, flattening the curve, and then another buzzword that was used. We have to balance the protection of lives and livelihoods. What a load of rubbish, right? Because what they were meaning is we have to be prepared to sacrifice a certain number of lives in order for profits to be continued to be made. Okay, so that's the thing. Whereas in China focused primarily on saving lives. And in the process, it saved the economy as well. But that's a very different type of economy anyway, because when our leaders in Western countries talk about the economy, they mean corporate profits. They don't mean the job of you and me and so on. So in that sense, the response was a completely neoliberal financialized response. And this is also very true in the case of the overall macroeconomic response, because, and I cottoned on to this, the reason why I wrote The Unexpected Reckoning, which began as an article, a standalone article on why I thought the pandemic was going to be very serious for Western economies, is well before the World Health Organization declared a pandemic, the Federal Reserve's chief response, as Professor Lowe said, the Western governments were not doing anything. They knew there was a virus in China. So what do you think? It was going to sit in China very happily, respecting border controls? No, it was going to spread all over the world. They did not prepare at all. But they were acting. They were acting for what mattered to them. And what mattered to them was the asset markets. The Federal Reserve was pouring trillions of dollars into the asset market so that they would not crash, because they were crashing, they had to be saved. And they did everything that it took to save asset markets. Meanwhile, they did nothing actually to save the people. Whatever they did that looked like saving the people was to save the crumbling healthcare system. And that too it was important to save it because corporations had to make money out of it. So on every possible way, if you look at, Engels has this term social murder. I think the term social murder has to be applied to Western governments' response to the crisis. And that's why I think it's important to emphasize, not just, it's important to say that China is meaningfully socialist. The key reason for the Chinese government's very different response to the pandemic is that the basis of its legitimacy, the class character of the Chinese state is radically different. The Chinese state cannot exist. If the party state is to retain its legitimacy, it could not have done otherwise. And that is the best guarantee we have, whereas we have, over the last so many decades, been putting up with a state that is primarily concerned about not only profits, but the profits of a small number of large corporations, not even the small business people whose businesses were mown down by the pandemic. Today you go out on any street, practically in the Western world, and you can point to the handful of businesses on that street that have been closed by the pandemic, that will never come back. Levels of labor force participation have plummeted. Why? Because these societies are not geared to deal with the pandemic. And why are they not geared to deal with the pandemic? Because they are not geared to protect people, period. Their main purpose is to protect capital. And I think that's the key difference we have to bear in mind. So I think I've now taken another 10 minutes. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll be quite quick in answering the questions. China seems to be the termination of the efforts of fighting the pandemics towards the end of 2022. That was to the surprise of many people, the observers, that in 3 weeks' time, by late November, China had the central government announced that it was going to continue with the same approach, a very tough control of the pandemic. But then that in less than 3 weeks' time, it had about face almost a U-turn of policy, that it was going to, it's not just announced, it also did it immediately to give up terminate the tough controls. So what happens? Why did they change the policies in such a short period of times? That's with hindsight, we can say that there were several reasons that is unintended, unplanned, but in the event, it did it that way. And one reason, of course, was the nature of Omicron, with the high transmission rates and seemingly the socially acceptable death rates, given the fact of vaccination already reaching well above 80% of on average, each person to have 3 or 2 doses supposed to be a full vaccination together with a booster. So that was possibly the underlying reason, that the view or assessment of the nature of Omicrons. But then there were additional reasons, right, that probably the spread of the virus was uncontrollable. Right? That you can see that immediately following the termination of the controls, that the hundreds of millions of the cases being reported. So that implies that there were already quite a large number of unreported infections already there before the official position, official policy of changing the position. And also, it's fair to say that social fatigue was the main driving force. That although the so-called white paper revolution, I think it was a joke, but that just a small, a very small scales, and very much promoted or incited by I think the so-called public intellectuals, that is liberal or neoliberals, how do you call it, key opinion leaders, right? That although the China has been portrayed as a society or a country with no dissident views, no dissident opinions, that's not true. Right? That all kinds of anti-society or anti-establishment opinions have been all around in China. That's always there. And from the time to time, they were the dominant views. Right? The authorities, the so-called propaganda department of the Communist Party, has been fighting difficult, doing has been, I don't have the ways to express it, right? That has been in the on the weaker side when it comes to public opinions. It has always been the case, right? In terms of the China's education system, in terms of the public opinions, the official propaganda, right? Propaganda in a neutral sense, right? Because the term propaganda is being used as in a dismissive sense in the West, but in the Soviet or Chinese tradition, propaganda is no more than a neutral term about the public opinions, right? Or the influences over public opinions. And of Chinese parties, state authorities have always been on the weaker side when it comes to the warfare, right, in public opinions. Right? So we don't need to go that far, right? The answer, the simple answer to the question about why abandoning the tough measures is the combination of the two things, right? The nature of Omicron and the preparedness for coping with Omicron. That's an issue of public health. But then at the level of the society, right, the social fatigue, right, meaning the rising cost, social cost of maintaining the tough measures, becoming exceedingly high. So somehow a balance that need to the consideration about striking a balance is always there, but now the balance turned to the other side. And then of course, then the next question, right? Death. We won't know until the population data of the excessive death, right? We would need to wait for probably another year before we can have data about the excessive death in China in 2023, right? Because China terminated the tough controls towards the end of the year 2022. Therefore, the effect would be seen that in the early months of this year. So we'll need to wait for another year to see the data. Right? And even so, it is not possible to know the death, the scale of death that directly caused by the virus, right? Because without the systematic testing, we don't know people die of or die with the virus. But nevertheless, at least up until the late 2022, the number of deaths reportedly caused by the virus was quite small. So I think that in the first 2 years, always the same number, like 4,500 or so. And skeptics might say that this number is fake, right? It's not true. But there's reason to believe that it's the true number. And it's because if the number remained the same for almost 2 years, then a single case of death because of the virus would change the number. Right? But it is impossible to cover up if there are cases, it's possible to cover up some cases, but it's not possible to cover up all cases. Right? Given the fact that you have all these social media that are controlled, but not completely. So I hope you can see the reasoning, right? That if the number remains the same, then it is difficult to say that this is the fake, but there are widespread covering up. But then what happens after the termination of the efforts to control the virus? That is another matter. As mentioned, we need to wait. Right? And the excessive death data in the year 2010, 2020 up to 2022, these numbers were consistent with the data about the death caused by the pandemic. And therefore, at least we can say that the data are reliable for the initial 3 years, but up until late last year. Now then, the next question about the economic change that is likely to happen. But actually, we have already seen the unfolding of the economic change. Like that, over the past weeks, there have been huge numbers of commentaries about the economic crisis in China and the possible, like the coming collapse of the Chinese economies. All these are really propaganda in a dismissive sense. Like China's economy, in the first half of the year, China has the year-on-year economic growth of 5.6%, slightly above the government target of 5% for the year as a whole. It's most likely that the target is to be achieved for the year, 5%, and that is the judgment and the political commitment of the government, which of course would need to bear the responsibilities if it missed out the target. And the commentaries or the comments by Western media normally says that the actual performance is missing, is below the level of the expectations. What is meant by expectations? Expectation is something that can be easily manipulated by the speculators, by political motivations. said that Joe Biden says that now China is in a crisis, and this the collapse of China is going to have the very systematic damaging effect on the world economy. That's what he said some 2 weeks ago. But now, if anything, it seems to be the opposite. That if you look at the Chinese economic data, consumption and investment have been growing fast, about 7% in the year on year in the first 7 months of this year. Now, exports, negative growth by about 15% or so. And it's not just China, but most of the other major exporting countries, say South Korea, Vietnam, Japan, they have all experienced very serious negative growth of exports. It is the world economy or the world markets that is in crisis, and China have been impacted to some extent. Now, but then it's not just the existence or otherwise of the crisis, economic crisis in China, but rather the prospects for long-term development. Now, immediately before the pandemic, of course, we know there was the trade war. Donald Trump announced the trade, imposed the trade war in 2018, and this has been escalated by Joe Biden. Of course, the trade war that was unintendedly undermined by the pandemic. The US wanted to decouple with China. Unexpectedly, its trade imports from China and its deficit with China increased massively in the 3 years under the pandemic. And that taught the US establishment a lesson that its reliance or its dependence on China was difficult to get rid of. And therefore, now we have seen the efforts to increasing efforts of decoupling. Now the new buzzwords, de-risking. But anyway, it's the same thing. That to re-establish or at least to reshape the world supply chains, reducing the reliance on China. And this is likely to be the prospects in the foreseeable future, that the US and to some extent the advanced capitalist countries to reshape the world supply chains, that reducing the dependence on China. And of course, the opposite efforts by China is, as we have seen, the expansion of the BRICS grouping and the massive increase in the scale of China's economic relationship with the Belt and Road Initiative countries. So again, this year, China's trades with Belt and Road countries have increased, in contrast to the decrease in its trading with the advanced capitalist countries. So it's likely that over the long term, the two different economies in the world, different economic blocks in the world is likely to emerge. So I hope that this answered the question.
Thank you. So our floor is now open to anyone who want to raise any questions or any comments to what's presented so far. Yes, please. For the sake of our online participants, maybe if you can come over to the mic so that they can hear it as well.
Can you take you put the work with just state? I know why our capital is there, because it must be, your face must be in the middle. I don't know.
Yeah, it should go to
Okay.
speaker view. I don't know why it's not showing you.
Yes. Is it not this one? Anyone can help me with this Spanish? Is it the first
It's
one?
already set to speaker view. Sometimes it malfunctions, don't worry.
Okay.
We can see each other, so it doesn't matter.
Can I ask my question from here?
If you don't want to show your face, just closer to the mic so that they can hear as well. Yes.
You can turn the mic towards us.
Is it the mic for this?
Okay, thank you for the great presentation. My name is Philip or Filippo Giordano. I actually live in China. I live in Shanghai. I teach at XJTLU in Suzhou. It's Shanjiaotong Liverpool University in Suzhou. So I have a question and a comment about this dichotomy between a tough response, or what I would call, virus suppression, being associated with, public health and caring for the people, when now we know that this response itself generated immense inequalities, right? So I would make a distinction between the intentions of this. Like, obviously the intentions of this policy were noble. They wanted to suppress the circulation of the virus and save lives. And not only in China, even in Italy, my family in Italy, for example, the first lockdown they experienced was almost as tough as the one in China. And it was understandable at the beginning, but then with the passage of time, a lot of people realize, okay, some companies are benefiting greatly from this, such as digital companies, because people stayed home, and so
بدك تحضر حبيبي معي ولا لا؟
people stayed home, and so they
Go to participants and mute anybody whose mic is not muted.
so people stayed home. They stayed, they spend a lot of time on social media. So who made money here? Facebook, Meta, Amazon, all these big companies. Small companies were devastated by the lockdown, much more than large companies.
Where?
In Italy, for example, I've only been in China 5 months, so I wasn't there during the lockdown, but I know about some of the distributional consequences of the lockdowns in many European countries. And I was actually in Toronto during the lockdowns. In Toronto, Canada, yeah, because there were lockdowns in Canada as well at the beginning. Okay, so you had and then there's been a rapid increase in mental health issues because of these policies, and who is more likely to face these or to experience these mental health issues? Younger people, because they were denied social activity, and people with big houses. Obviously, a lockdown for them would be different from somebody who's living in a dorm or a one-bedroom apartment. So over time, this I think increased mental health problems, which probably also increased the profits of companies selling antidepressants. So, I guess the general point is this: these policies, whether or not they were intended by concern for well-being and these kinds of things, they did generate a lot of new inequalities, and they did benefit a lot of politically connected firms, and big firms who, and they penalize a lot of small firms, right? And so I think my comment would be, and or my suggestion is is to distinguish between, what were the intentions of these policies, which were noble, and what were the actual outcomes. And then once we know what the outcomes are, at what point do policymakers have responsibility to take account of these harms that were caused, right? Because policies always have distributional costs and benefits, always, right? So the goal might be to suppress the virus, but then over time, it produces a lot of other things, many of which I would argue generate inequality, which can have long-term harms. It doesn't mean the policy was bad. Obviously, you had to try to stop the circulation of the virus, but the harms that the policies cost, I think, should be taken account.
Okay, thank you, Alicia, and then John. Okay.
Well, maybe I can go here. Well, thank you. Well, first, I agree with Radhika, and most of the policies that we have had during the last decades, especially after the Washington Consensus, and then all the austerity policies that the International Monetary Fund has implemented, at least in Latin America and in another third world countries. If you relate the austerity with the health system and education system, we lost our health system. And that's why we had a lot of people, a lot of inequality, and we just couldn't affront the virus. Then the other thing that I want to say is, of course, I was in the university, and today we have the students in the classrooms, and the next day we were in the digital economy. So what happened? The people that has an intelligent phone or a Mac or a computer just could do it immediately. So we didn't have any problem. But the people, especially in the rural areas that don't have a digital school, or they don't have access to the computer, we lost a lot in education. Not only one semester, I think at least we lost 2 years of education. So that immediately impact in our inequality in the social sphere. And that other thing that I want to say is that we divided the working force. The people who was, I don't know how to say in English, Radhika, essential workers. Essential workers. So all the people that were in the essentials, and that they were for different platforms, when you just put in the computer and they give you the food to your home and all that, well, they weren't vaccinated. Most people die. And the other thing is that we have, you said a very important thing is that the economy, at least in Mexico, our president, as the same as Trump, they say they were not virus. That was, I don't know, like a crazy thing. And even they didn't want in the beginning to, well, they were a negation process, because the thing is that they want to save the economy. That they know immediately that if they stop the economy and they have the lockdown, we were going to lose in economy. So this is very sad, but that's happened in many countries, at least in Latin America and in Mexico. I only want to say something like that.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Yes, Chong, and then gentleman.
What is if you want to put us on the big screen, you can try to click on our view there. And, on the left, sort of, I click on you. Just you can click on you, like to the left.
Yeah, you can pin your.
Yeah, exactly.
This one.
No. When you get the cursor over your face, for example.
The cursor,
Yeah.
Yes, and then click in the three dots. And you can click on the third one from the bottom upwards.
This one?
Yeah, this one.
Descarga para todos.
Yeah, right. The one above.
Above that,
Yeah, this one. Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you. Yes, it can be done. Thanks.
Right, okay. My name is John. I happen to work for one of the biggest trade unions in Britain, and I cover the NHS. So it's mainly to address the questions or comments you made. I think, I think it can be empirically proven that the intention of the British government in its various sort of zigzags throughout the pandemic is not to save lives, right? I think the fundamental point about the NHS, about the setup within which the political economic setup in which the NHS finds itself in, it's one of neoliberal capitalism. So the NHS was already not working when a pandemic happened. And the initial response from the government was to prepare, I think, 500,000 body bags. They got leaked to the press. There was an outcry against it. Then they start to talk about, how should I put it, half-assed measures to suppress the virus, but they were never intending to suppress the virus because they know, the people who run the NHS know, they do not have the capacity to do anything that really, in reality, resembled what China was doing when the whole thing broke out in Wuhan. They just don't have the capacity. I'll give you one prime example, right? So in Wuhan, they set up specialized hospitals to treat acute patients, and they sent medics and doctors, and like literally about like 50,000 like doctors and nurses all over the country when they still Wuhan, the metropolitan area of about 7-10 million people in a lockdown, right? So they set up these specialized hospitals. There were 2 of them specifically, and they successfully saved, like thousands of people, literally, right? So, but in Britain, they cannot really do that, but because it's good press, right? It's good optics. So they set up these things called the Nightingale hospitals, right? And I remember because when the whole thing broke out, the NHS senior management, they tried to be open, right? They tried to pull people in because they realized that they had a massive public relations disaster on their hands because, there are stories about whole families. It was the first wave, right? People dying in their own homes. There were cross-infection, lots of old people dying, younger people dying, and Boris Johnson almost died, right? So there was a short period of time when senior NHS management, they're actually meeting with trade union representatives, right? Not to talk about anything specific, but to show that they were listening, right? So we'll talk about the Nightingale hospitals, which they set up in exhibition centers, right? So there's this big exhibition center in East London, it's called Excel, right? It's just an exhibition center, right? But because it's got this optics of a wide open space, right? It's good for newspaper photographs, right? So they set up this place there, right? They put some beds in there, they put a few doctors in there, they put some nurses in there, and then they did a whole show for the first 2 weeks of show. Also, right, where they will ship some of the acute patients to this place, right? Then in these meetings, they readily admitted that these things were just for show because the actual NHS itself was already on the brink of collapse, right? And these Nightingale hospitals were set up in places that were not hygienic, they're not well equipped to actually look after acute patients, right? So if they have to ship someone acute there, they have to eventually send them back to ICUs. And they were already being overwhelmed. The big actual NHS hospitals were being overwhelmed, right? So it was a massive PR exercise. They built something in London, they built something in Birmingham, but none of them worked because there were no staff. They didn't have nurses, they didn't have doctors, and they eventually have to pull off the whole thing because the doctors and nurses actually needed in ICUs where they actually needed, right? So, and I can give you more examples, right? So where I am at the coalface, because I do represent NHS members of the trade union, they don't have actual PPE. They scream about it for months, that nothing. Then Boris Johnson got a mate of his, again, another mate of his, to send substandard PPE, right? So this whole thing around, so this whole rhetoric about saving lives, but it was never about saving lives. It's about preventing, in hindsight, I feel, a popular upsurge. They try to divert popular anger towards something else, right? And I think they more or less successfully managed to do so, because when this whole thing happened, what you should have expected is that you should have some working class opposition to the malfeasance and mismanagement of government. But unfortunately, most of the trade unions went along with it. Because again, it's a whole 30 years of neoliberal collaboration between the main Social Democratic Party, the Labour Party, you know, notwithstanding the Corbyn period. I mean, Corbyn is like an outliner to the whole thing, right? Most of the Labour hierarchy, the trade union hierarchy, they were very keen to help the government in its time of crisis, right? They didn't want to create more PR problems for the government, right? So they happily went on this whole charade with the Nightingale hospitals. They did not really push the question of PPEs, right? It was eventually, you know, like it was turned to a thing in Parliament, but you know, it wasn't done to save people. So, you know, there are lockdowns, there are suppression, they're all in quotation marks. But I guess what chapter 5 specifically of Radhika's book in particular, I think successfully explained that, you know, even though objectively you've got all this, you know, including what the independent sage said in the UK, right? With all these standard public health responses that can save people and minimize that harm to the economy and to people that you mentioned, right? But they were never carried out with any real intention in the most neoliberal countries, and that's just a fact. I don't know the Canadian context, I don't know the Italian context, I don't know how these lockdowns are, but in the UK, the lockdowns are a joke, right? All they say to people is stay at home, right? But if you looked at China, the government, apart from organizing medical assistance, they also organize social assistance, right? So they made a point of organizing Communist Party members, young Communist League members, cadres from, you know, everywhere, community organizers, to actually knock on everyone's doors who are locked down to ensure that they're all right. They get food, they get someone to talk to, etc., etc. They organize social activities, even in places where they were quarantined, right? So when they do lockdowns in China, right, they were completely different from what we experience in the West, right? In the West, they just told, you know, people just told, stay at home, right? So there's a huge disparity between people who could work from home and people who still have to brave it, like NHS workers, right? So those people die in thousands. No one said any words about them, right? I mean, there's a bit of like really quiet stuff like, you know, complain about, you know, what about NHS workers and et cetera, et cetera. But in the UK, right, it's now commonly acknowledged that maybe 300,000 to 400,000 people are more or less permanently taken out of the labor force. Then you have Brexit. So if you have this, you know, all these factors are combining to make that economy much worse, but all these things didn't really apply to China, or don't really apply to China, because China has a complete different state, a different type of state, a different type of political economy. So to compare lockdowns and lockdowns with lockdowns, I think the fundamental point in terms of methodology is to understand that you have two types of political economy. Even though the Chinese political economy is not, there are large parts of China's political economy which are capitalistic, right? There are many rich people, there's social inequalities, and you know, it's there, right? No one's going to lie about it. But the state is not controlled by oligarchs. I think that makes a massive difference. And the state has the capacity to marshal enormous resources in a time of crisis, which the liberalized states in the West, they don't have the capacity to do so, and they have the heart to do so, because they do the bidding of the largest monopolies, like, you know, big tech, big pharma, etc., etc. So I'm done with my rant.
Thank you, Chong. Yes, gentlemen, please come. You want to speak from there, or yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Baba. I'm the Health and Social Sector Officer of Public Services International, PSI. I think, I mean, quite clear enough, the impact of neoliberal financialization on health and social care cannot be overemphasized. And often, whilst we look at it in terms of different countries, for me, in a sense, the sharpest picture is even when, well, amongst other things, when you look at it in a country, Italy. I mean, Lombardy region, where you had the height of the surge in Italy, is where you had the utmost of introduction of health sector reforms based on neoliberal paradigm of development. And despite being the wealthiest, it could cope the least when the pandemic came calling in Italy. So for me, that's a very important aspect in showing how that the place of neoliberalism in allowing a disaster like that to happen globally. And definitely I agree with the fact that China was better able to cope with it. There are, however, a few things I think need to be put in consideration, some of which are there already in the presentation, but which I think could be also better foregrounded. And then a few others outside. I mean, starting with the place of knowledge from last experience. You know, there's a saying in my place that someone whom a crocodile ate his or her mother, when you see even a lizard, you get very, very jittery, you know. So China had the experiences of SARS-1 and SARS-2, you know, and I think this is quite important, both in terms of the psychology and institutional learning and readiness. Then a part I think is often not as emphasized in the response on the part of China. We heard a lot about the vaccines. To me, when you're talking of 200% vaccination, I mean, it becomes meaningless, the extent of which is more than which, when you now put it beside, like in Africa, you understand? So to me, that is really, with regards to the issue of the response, I think an underemphasized aspect has to do with some important elements of countermeasures, including like personal protective equipment and the place of China in the global supply chain, global health sector supply. And it's because as PSI pointed out at the beginning of that crisis itself, that the shortage of the PPE was a global emergency within the global health emergency. But China was sort of at the fount of that supply chain, being the world workshop, even for that, you know. So, and these are important not only for looking back, but especially at this point in time, well, despite all its politics, I don't think that's the issue of the pandemic accord and all that. I think the key things ahead will be settled outside and not within the hallowed chambers, so to speak, of the WHO and the United Nations. And because you see a lot of geopolitics being put before the needs of the people, and profit also, of course, along with that. But finally, I think, and this goes without, this goes beyond even just China. I think the place of surveillance capitalism, the place of, because it's not even only in China, I mean, look at in Korea, because when we look at success stories in curtailing things, we need to also look at Korea, Thailand to some extent, but also Taiwan, and how, you know, the different ways and means, like in South Korea, just like with China, the place of surveillance in different ways, though, was quite useful for tracing, tracking, and things like that. Finally, I think because this aspect is essentially on China, the COVID-19, and I would, you could say, play a role of Anderson. Well, no, I wouldn't, I wouldn't say that. But I feel uncomfortable realizing that, yes, there are socialistic elements of Chinese economy and capitalistic element, but I feel uncomfortable considering a country with the second largest number of billionaires in the world, essentially a different kind of economy, you know? I think it is not, considering the fact that an emergent society forms in the womb of the old. I mean, even as way back as the 19th century, you had talks of invading socialism within capitalism. So I think the way I see it, I think we're looking at a form of capitalism where you have a distinctly, where the question of the relative autonomy of the states takes on, I wouldn't say an exaggerated role, but plays a central role in social organization rather than transcending the logic and dynamics of capitalist development. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Yes, Ellen, please.
Well, if I speak from here, can everybody hear? Yeah, it's very interesting to hear my trade union colleagues from England speaking, because I was the president of the union in the Ken Livingstone's administration and Boris Johnson's administration in London, and then left and went to Canada. And the comparisons are interesting because in Canada, the reaction of the public has been captured into the whole way that the mishandling of vaccination and dealing with the virus has been entirely captured by the right wing. So you may have heard of the truckers' convoy. Now, there were genuine grievances because no facilities were afforded for truckers who were told, you must be vaccinated. If you can't be vaccinated, you won't be allowed in, but were also basically shunned by cafe owners, shunned, you know, they had to go and sort of crap in the woods because nobody would let them in, right? So they're abominably treated by society, received no support whatsoever. And then when the truckers' convoy came along, I wouldn't say that I was captured by them. And in fact, there's a quite deep division amongst the truckers, and we've worked with, you know, sort of various groups of truckers to try and isolate to some extent the influence of the right wing. But the truckers' convoy was run by completely right wing people. It had a prehistory where they actually, in Alberta, where there's only one unionized oil refinery, they took their convoy, a previous convoy they had, out of the way to go to that and break the picket line. So that's the kind of people that they were, right? But nevertheless, they captured the initiative and they've won. They've won. I mean, I think it's not only has Trudeau backed down on really doing anything about coronavirus at all, but it's very likely that the quite right-wing guy who now runs the Conservative Party will win the next election, and he'll win it on an anti-vaccination platform. He'll win it on a freedom platform. It will be, you know, these buggers make you lock down, they give you these vaccinations, they force them on you, they kill your kids, all that crap. That's what's going around, and you know about the United States. So I'm wondering, what was the, my question is really, you know, what was the public perception in China of the success of the policies? I mean, you sort of touched on it, but, you know, to what extent is the population feeling that they have a government who did the right thing or the best that they could? I get the feeling they think that, but on the other hand, there was a moment when there were quite serious mobilizations that said that the lockdown is too much, we can't cope anymore. I would also be very interested whether there's been any comparison between Hong Kong and mainland China, because I have friends in Hong Kong who say that Hong Kong essentially did not follow the same policies as mainland. I don't know if that's true or not, but if not, if it is true, then the comparative success of the policies in Hong Kong and mainland would be important. And the final point is, what has the effect been on business? It seems a strange question, but Radhika and I actually have been put in the position of doing something we never did before the virus, which is organizing massively online seminars. We set up a little organization called the International Manifesto Group, which holds regular webinars and has brought together, you know, socialists from all over the world, including particularly China and now also Russia. And that was forced on us in a certain sense, because if you were locked in, you had to work from home. Now, one of the interesting, I do research on the economy of the creative industries. You may not think this is relevant, but there's been a huge increase in the wages of performers in Canada by a very peculiar mechanism, which is that the online industries have become massively increased employers. So all the artists suddenly found that they'd got jobs paying 3 times, all the performers got paying 3 times what they were getting before, because all the performance venues were closed. The only place where the lockdown was really effective was you couldn't go to a concert, you couldn't go to a rock concert, and you couldn't go to church. These are the two big effects. So people started doing everything online. I don't know if they talked to God online, but they certainly, you know, they did performances online. And so they became very big employers. And there's actually a labor shortage in the creative industries in my city, because so many people have got work with the film industry or the video industry that you can't, a lot of arts are run on a volunteer basis. They can't get enough volunteers anymore because everybody's being paid 3 times as much as they were in previous times. So I'm just wondering, you know, what has been the effect? It's a paradoxical effect, the effect on business. And I think you have seen a massive growth in online activity, which has been in some places a source of employment, but I don't know. I'd be interested.
Let's come ahead. I think we will have, yeah, you yourself. Because we have online participants, so they can't hear you from that far.
I have a very brief, short question. I came late to the conversation, so maybe it might have been already covered. My name is Haris. I'm a doctoral candidate. My question is very, like, what explains lower mortality rates in countries like Pakistan, which, or many other African countries, or countries like Sri Lanka, which immediately relied on vaccinations from countries like China, when, you know, supply chain of vaccines was being secured by America in, you know, Pfizer and all. So what explains, like, I mean, one of the argument was made that, you know, it's hard to underreport death rates in times like we have now. And we saw it in case of India, which highly underreported its cases, even though it recorded almost 500,000 deaths in the second wave. So for me, the question becomes more important, because then is it the frame of reference? Because Pakistan, arguably, which has 90% of its economy run informally, refused to hold a hard lockdown in opposed to what China did, yet it was able to sort of, arguably successfully able to sort of mitigate some of the impact of the coronavirus. So is perhaps, and same is the case with countries like Western Europe, which did a half-hearted lockdown, but kept its economy, most like Netherlands kept its economy running in one way or the other way. So rather than looking at, you know, the dichotomy between the, you know, West, where the public infrastructure, the health infrastructure is quite upgraded, yet failed to, you know, mitigate the consequences of the coronavirus, versus an authoritarian country, arguably like China, a good public health infrastructure, versus countries which have poor infrastructure, yet able to, weak governments, yet able to mitigate. So what explains that? Is the frame of reference rather wrong? Like, we are looking at it from a state perspective, should it be from a more social or from any other sense? Yeah, that's my short question.
Thank you. Very important. So I think I will pass it back to you. Then we will finish this session. Yeah. If you want to just give a brief response to anything that you would like to respond to.
I think that in the first place, we need to bear in mind that it is an issue of governance, right? That to do anything to control the pandemic or not to do anything or to what to be done, what specific strategy to be adopted, all this need to be done in consideration of the balance between the cost and the cost in the broader sense for the society and the benefit. Right? And it's not simply a matter of the politics that those ruling blocks, to name it Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or Xi Jinping, they care or not care about the lives of people, or they not care about their vested interests versus the broader society. It's not that simple. Right? That's in the first place, from the perspective of observers or people that try to make sense of what have been going on, they need to know that this is, in the first place, a matter of governance, right? That balancing benefits and costs for the society as a whole. And therefore, all this issue about, in the case of China, about the different kinds of social costs under the lockdown, inequality, mental health problems, or in fact not just mental but physical as well. So people with other illnesses, other disease unrelated to COVID, they might have received insufficient care, insufficient treatment because of the lockdowns or tough measures. These are not unique to China, but unique in the particular form, like that China, because of the tough model, I think there was one very famous incident in Urumqi, that fire, the outbreak of a fire, that the firefighters could not get into the place because of the lockdowns, and of course there were different versions of the story, but the point remains clear that because of tough measures of controlling the virus, there was severe delays for the firefighting and causing the tragedies. And that's a telling example of the difficulties of public have the decision making, and therefore the assessments of the different models need to go from there, looking at the governance, and from there to relate the governance issue to the political underlying political economic regimes or systems, whether it's neoliberals or to what extent it's neoliberal, to what extent it's prioritizing the profits and the profits of particular interests, the speculators, versus the profits of the rest of the capitalist class, or versus the welfare of the society as a whole. All this we therefore need to infer from these complex experiences to come out with judgments, deepening our understanding of the working and of the functioning and the nature of the existing political economic systems. So this is the main point, a message I try to deliver in this lecture and also in this talk, and also my responses to the questions. Not just a very specific points about Hong Kong. Hong Kong was torn in between the two different models that we note immediately before the pandemic, and in fact, in the early months of the pandemic, the riots were still there. The riots in the West being portrayed as pro-democracy movements, but in my views, no more than local sovereignness and bordering fascism. But anyway, internally, there were the forces demanding Hong Kong to follow the British or the US model of coping with the pandemics. But then, of course, because of the one country, of the formula of one country, two systems formula, that it could not simply ignore what the strategy adopted in the mainland. So in the end, it had the worst of the two models, that it had all the costs of associated with the what I call the US or UK model of coping with the pandemic, people refusing the testing, and refusing vaccination, a sizable proportion of the population. And the government was quite hesitant in promoting the universal testing. In the end, it did not. And also hesitant to do the lockdowns. And you can put it in comparison with another country, or another city state, Singapore. Singapore forcefully adopted all the China-type measures in the 2021. And then in 2022, it very quickly switched to the say tough model, US type tough model, right? That of course in preparation for the switch, it had almost complete testing and full vaccination of the society. It seems to have got the benefits of the maximum benefits of the two models, and also the minimum cost of the two models. And Hong Kong seems to be the opposite, getting the maximum damages of the two models and minimum benefits of the two models. So and ultimately it's politics, right? That the Hong Kong politics was torn between the conflict between the two systems. And the Singapore had the autonomy, but at least in this particular circumstance or events. So this provides food for thought for assessing the two models and ultimately assessing the politics. So again, not well organized answers or the summary of the workshop, but I hope to be able to give some insights in my own chaotic understanding of the pandemics, and the efforts to cope with the pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for choosing this very difficult topic, and yes, broaden our discussions. I think is a very good start for our workshop. I think also to the conference as well. So thank you again, Dick, for your presentation, and to Radhika for your insightful responses and feedback, and for everyone for your participation. So we are ending the first session today. We will have lunch break, which you can find lunch in the cafeteria, just along the corridor or further down outside the entrance, up the stairs. We come back to this room at 1:30 to start the second session, which we are going to talk about Brazil and China. Thank you. See you later.